Welcome to Discover You, an inspiring podcast exploring cutting-edge solutions to our everyday psychological challenges. We explore complex mental health issues and talk to professionals, experts, and renowned authorities at the forefront of transformative healing. Our mission is to educate and destigmatize, and to ultimately view mental health as a proactive quest for optimized living and equilibrium, rather than mere crisis intervention. Welcome to another episode of Discover You, our podcast exploring innovative and effective solutions to issues in behavioral health. I'm JD Kalmenson, CEO of Montare Behavioral Health, a family of dynamic and comprehensive treatment centers in Southern California. I'm so honored to be able to introduce you to our incredibly knowledgeable, inspiring, and engaging guest today, Katherine Woodward Thomas. Katherine is the New York Times bestselling author of Conscious Uncoupling, 5 Steps to Living Happily Even After, and Calling in the One, 7 weeks to Attracting the Love of Your Life, as well as an award-winning marriage and family psychotherapist. Over the past 2 decades, Katherine has had the honor of teaching hundreds of thousands of people from all corners of the globe to create conscious, loving relationships and to realize the higher potentials of all their connections, their connections for health and happiness. Welcome, Katherine. So happy to have you with us today. And I'm eager and really interested to hear your perspective on so many different issues. So why don't we jump right in? I always found it very telling that one of the leading forms of therapeutic licenses in California and across the country is the MFT, the marriage family therapist, which essentially highlights the intermingling thread between relationships and mental health in general. Most people don't think that the success or failure of their relationships has too much of an association with their mental health. Is there a correlation between the quality of our relationships and the quality of our mental health? And if so, how do you see that?
Wow. Let's get right to the point, shall we? Right to the heart of the matter. I think that the essence of well-being in life has to do with the quality of our connections, the quality of our connection to ourselves and certainly to each other. Many of the beliefs that we struggle with that are kind of at the core of chronic depression or chronic anxiety are relational in nature. Certainly patterns of codependence, all of the relational traumas that we suffered in our youth that kind of set us up for these challenging patterns that make relationships painful and challenging and kind of heartbreaking at times, are really, they're all about the primary relationships that we initially had. So the cornerstone of mental health is indeed relationships. How we feel about ourselves, who we are, what our sense of self is all relational. Our purpose in life is all relational. And I do think it's interesting. I've been a spiritual practitioner since I was the age of 14. I had a beautiful spiritual experience at 14, and I started doing all sorts of things to pursue and grow that side of myself. And I think that sometimes in the world of spiritual practitioners, we look at love as a universal phenomenon, where we look at, certainly in the Buddhist path, we talk about compassion, and it's a very impersonal kind of love that we're growing consciously. And because we're not very focused on personal love, we somehow relegate personal love as to a sense of irrelevancy in our lives. But personal love is one of the more beautiful forms of love. And frankly, it has everything to do with how well we are in life and how far we can go in our creativity and our full contribution. Nature has designed us to be interdependent creatures. You even see that physiologically. When we are in relationship with others, our whole bodies will regulate to the just the somatic patterns of our intimate partner. Our heart rate will start to sync up, our body temperature, our blood pressure, all things start to kind of sync up with the people that we are closest to in life. And relationships regulate us. They help us to regulate our emotions, and they keep us safe. In fact, relationships are really the only safety that we've been given in this lifetime. Life is a pretty precarious, unknown commodity, and none of us really know for sure how long we're going to be here and what the circumstances are going to be in our lives. So the thing that we can find solace in and safety in is our relationships. So I cannot emphasize how important it is for us to grow ourselves in the direction of health, in the direction of vitality, and love, true love in our connection with others.
Wow, that was very, very beautiful. So you were talking about being a spiritual practitioner. So besides for my day-to-day deeply immersed involvement in the world of mental health, my formal training back in the day was as a rabbi. So I have to share with you the connect question by preceding it with a more lighthearted story. There was a camel, and well, let's not talk about the camel for a second. There was a couple, and the couple, they were married for 51 years without having had one argument. And at their anniversary, one of the attendees says, "How do you guys do it? Is not one argument for 51 years?" And the husband says, "Well, it's really quite simple. On our honeymoon, we went to the desert, and we each rented a camel, and we went camelback riding. And my wife's camel sort of bucked, and she gets off the camel and looks at it squarely in the eye and says, 'That's number one.' She gets back on the camel. They continue going for some time. The camel bucks again. She gets off the camel and she looks at the camel squarely in the eye and says, 'That's number two.' And the third time the camel bucks, she swings off the camel, whips out a pistol, shoots it between the eyes. And the husband says, 'Oh my gosh, honey, that's what happened to you. That seems so heavy-handed. Gosh.' And she looked at me squarely in the eyes and she said, 'That's number one.'"
That's number one.
All relationships have ups and downs, right? So friendships, romantic relationships, work relationships included. And the question I would love to get your take on is, how do we best work through the disagreements when they inevitably arise?
Well, disagreements in and of themselves are not bad news at all. And as a matter of fact, it's kind of the nature of relationships to have disagreements in areas of complete incompatibility, because we have to recognize we are full-blown human beings with our own subjective experience and our own way of viewing the world, our own goals, our own callings, our own sensibilities, our own rhythms. And relationships are about having a connection with someone who is completely different than we are in many ways. So I think the wonderful news about having disagreements is that it's an opportunity to deepen into one's own autonomy and the discovery of who you're in relationship with, and the curiosity of what went into forming that particular belief or that sensibility, and how does it work, and what's the benefit of that way of being, what's the burden of that way of being, right? So I think it's important to know that all good relationships, and this is something that John Gottman found in his studies, have at least 6 areas of incompatibilities. And so this idea that your perfect person thinks like you, agrees with you, it's not how it is. Now, what happens when somebody disagrees with us in a way that we feel threatened by? That's where we get in trouble, where we're bringing the past into the present. Somebody says, "Please pass the salt," in a particular way, not looking at us the way we want to be looked at, whatever it is, and how we're reading into that, right? That's the projective identification. That's a really, and in lay terms, it's just simply your beliefs about other people. A lot of us work on our beliefs about ourselves. I have a belief about myself that I'm not good enough, for example, or I have a belief about myself that I'm all alone. But inside of those beliefs, there's a relational aspect to it. So the I'm not good enough belief, the relational part is that other people are better than me, or other people are going to judge me or not like me because, I'm not pleasing them. Or from I'm alone, the intersubjective connection where I'm projecting onto that person might be they're going to leave me if I don't please them, or no one is ever really there for me. So when we have these kinds of lenses that we're perceiving any kind of threat, even if it was just please pass the salt in a non-loving way, we'll go into, it will begin to elicit things from us. This is where we get in trouble with people. We want to go to attack, we want to defend, we want to start explaining and self-promoting our position, as opposed to being curious about what's happening for that other person. So the work that we're doing in becoming more conscious of ourselves and tapping into the unconscious. Sometimes we talk about the unconscious as though it's somewhere out there. It's so mysterious. We have no access to it. The unconscious is kind of the feeling you get in your body. It's right in your body. So if you learn how to start to track your own beliefs, your own assumptions, you can kind of, you can learn how to reality check that assumption. I hear Brene Brown talking. One of the things she said in her recent talk is she's talking about something with her husband. And she says, the story I'm telling right now about you and how you feel about this is it. What your assumptions are is it. Right? So that's a reality check on that assumption. So the thing about conflict is that conflict is a way to actually grow intimacy. And if you avoid conflict, you end up with what we call a pseudo relationship, where you're kind of self-abandoning just to keep the cohesion. It's an immature way of keeping safety in the connection, because your relationship to conflict is inside of a core belief of somehow I'm alone, no one's really there for me. There's just an automatic, and those are young conversations. There's an automatic knee-jerk assumption that if I don't agree with this person, or if I'm too much trouble, that person might leave. So there's an assumption that conflict is the beginning of the end. But the truth about conflict is that it's actually the beginning of depth between the two of you. It's the beginning of growing an appreciation for the fact that there's two people here, both worthy of having feelings, of having thoughts, of having needs that are different from the other person. And that's the adventure of relationship. I almost have to back up just a moment, JD, and just give us an overview of the context in which we're even having this conversation, which is to remember that Stephanie Coons wrote that wonderful book, Marriage, A History. She's just brilliant. She really distinguished for us that, well, she said in the last 30 years, but it's been 20 years or more since she wrote the book. I'll say in the last 50 years, relationships have changed more than they did in the 5,000 years before. And we're really just, a shadow outside of role-based relationships, where there's really only one person in the relationship who's holding power. We are now in a paradigm of equal partnership, where really for the first time in recorded history, both people are sharing power in the relationship. And so we don't know how to do that yet because we didn't have models for it. It's a brand new phenomenon on planet Earth. There's certainly recorded human history that we would know how to do this. So there's great teachers that are teaching us how to work out conflict. You want to welcome differences of opinions. And you want to, number one, if you're engaging with your person, is to remember the context of the connection, and the overall context will inform what your goal is going to be for that communication. For example, if you're having a breakdown with your ex-husband and the two of you are not necessarily good friends, but really committed to co-raising your children to be happy children, you're not going to start working out all your interpersonal issues about what he just did or didn't do. But you are going to bring forth the information that is important in the context of what your shared purpose is, the mission of the relationship. So you might engage a conflict on a more practical level with that person, where if it's your lover, you're going to need to go deeper and really bring forth, the deeper dimensions of your own projections and what did they really mean by that, and what you're noticing about your own interpretive lens, or where you went to try and defend yourself and what you could do instead, because you're growth partners now in the new paradigm of relationship. So you want to notice the context. You always want to start at the end. You want to say something like to your former husband, look, we don't always agree on everything, but I know we're both committed to the happiness of our kids. So let's just work this out so that, it doesn't get in the way of the kids and they feel like we're clean with each other next time we're together. Right? That's starting with the end. That's where we want to go. Because in that moment, the other person's going to go, yeah, I'm up for that. That sounds like a good plan. And they're leaning in. So defenses are lower. You're affirming the value of the relationship. A lot of times we live in such a transient society that people get nervous when there's a conflict and they think that someone's going to leave. And so they start doing their little, giving all their power away just to try and placate the other person. That's not what we're looking for. We're all up for authentic relationship where we're all holding power. They feel clean. They feel in integrity. And so, and the other thing is you can't argue just to get your way. If you really want a, authentic relationship, you have to argue in service to deepening understanding between you. So there's something bigger than your own desire to get what you want in that moment. That was a mouthful too, JD.
That's beautiful. That's beautiful. So many things to unpack there. I mean, this entire question and what you're highlighting and exposing is that it ultimately does fall back on the first question, that disagreements only become toxic, hostile, and unhealthy when we haven't figured ourselves out and our mental health and behavioral health isn't optimized. Because what you're saying, and I see this all the time, is people becoming defensive, which is a code word for really taking things personal and allowing their identity, their self-worth to be on the referendum of who wins this argument. So the argument becomes existential versus cosmetic, and we're no longer having an objective conversation about how to get something done or what's the most effective solution, but it almost becomes a little bit of a battle of who's more important or who's less important, etc. That's obviously never a conversation both parties can win. So having a healthy sense of self and deepening that knowledge of self through a potential disagreement, but still having the baseline, existentially validated and affirmed is so important. You talked about.
I think, yeah. And I think you're really tapping into the core of it, JD, when you talk about identity and where we go. And that's the meaning that we're making. That's what we're bringing into it. So something happens, we feel a little bit threatened, and we will immediately drop down into that little 3-year-old. And if we don't know that we've done that, and if we don't know how to then kind of internally hold and contain that 3-year-old and stay in our adult center, then we're in trouble. Or to at least say, honey, I got to stop this because I'm 3 years old right now fighting for my life. And I cannot have this conversation right now in any sane way. Like, that's what you need to know about yourself, because that's just human.
Right.
But I find that when I do that with my partner, if I do that, if I stop and I say, Sweetheart, or even if I'm mad at him, I don't call him sweetheart. Michael. Michael, I have to stop you because all I can hear is I'm the 7-year-old and you're mad at me and you're going to leave me. And I can't even have this conversation right now because that's all I can feel right now. If I say something that truthful, he goes right into his heart. He just wants to stop and he wants to say, honey, I would never leave you. Oh my God. He wants to hold me, wants to kiss me. Like that becomes what's happening until we can get back into a more rational adult place of clarity, you know? So I think it's important so it's not that we have to get rid of these beliefs, but we do have to know ourselves well enough to know when we're speaking from them.
Right. Well, Michael, if you're listening, the secret's out. But on a more serious note, on a different topic altogether, so a lot of the work that we do at Renewal Health Group, which is, a network of treatment centers dedicated to strengthening and maintaining and really innovating the landscape of addiction recovery. So within that community, and it's a close-knitted community, there is a philosophy that one should not do any serious dating for the first year, let's say after recovery.
Yeah.
The thought being, if you haven't figured yourself out, don't bring anybody on the journey yet. It might be premature. Would love to hear your thoughts on that. And would you apply that to someone who's in recovery in general, in the mental health, behavioral health arena, even without chemical dependency? Somebody is still on their journey, and then it becomes very vague and subjective. Aren't we all on a journey? And when does the journey ever end? When do we truly figure ourselves out? And if so, before I follow it up with additional prongs, let me get your take on that.
All right, great. First of all, I'm so happy to talk to addicts because I'm a recovered addict myself. And spent 12 years in 12-step programs, which I loved. And I so into the time. I mean, I'm in my 60s now, so I was going when it was in my 20s and 30s. But sometimes if I ever go to a meeting again these days, I go back and I say, I'm coming back to visit the folks because I felt like I grew up in the rooms. I think it's just, what I know about recovery, and I only know really 12-step and psychotherapy. I know that there's a lot of wonderful, innovative programs around recovery now that I can't quite speak to, but I think you're talking about a suggestion that was made even back then to me. And I think it's a good plan. I mean, AA was wise enough, Bill W. was wise enough to not tell addicts what to do, but to make very strong suggestions. So this was a suggestion. And I think the reason is most people who have addictions and who are early on in recovery, they're not strong yet in being able to regulate their own emotions. And they are, I mean, the kind of the seeds of addiction is almost, if you look at it from a psychological perspective, you mentioned before, GD, having a solid sense of self. Early on, addicts in recovery don't yet have that solid sense of self because the addictions are almost a substitute for a kind of way to self-regulate, a way to soothe ourselves, to create safety for ourselves. And of course, it's kind of ludicrous because it's anything but that. But, none of it has to make sense. That numbing out, that ritual of the addiction, all of that is kind of a pseudo safety mechanism. So one of the tasks of early recovery is to begin to form a relationship with yourself where you're starting to become aware of what you're feeling in a way where you can learn how to hold that feeling from a deeper center. It's different than just feeling your feelings. Sometimes when we go to feel our feelings, the feelings feel bigger than we are. There was a study done at UCLA with this phenomenon of just labeling our feelings. And what they did is they brought in people to look at a computer screen, and there were faces that were, just kind of expressing certain emotions: horror, rage, disgust, hatred, all of terror. And they were just flashing the pictures across the screen, and they were monitoring blood pressure and heart rate and all that. And people, somatic response was kind of off the charts. And then with another study group, they put those same exact pictures, but they put a label on them. They put a name on them: terror, horror, shame, fear, whatever it was. And the somatic responses were not nearly as intense. And what the takeaway is from that study is that when we're able to name our emotions, suddenly they're less threatening, and we're less apt to get overwhelmed by them. So one of the things that I teach people to do in my community, that I learned from a wonderful psychotherapist named Stephen Gilligan, who's created self-relations therapy, is this simple practice. I call it the self-love power practice, where someone closes their eyes. And if you're a practitioner, you can teach your clients to do this for themselves. So you're not doing it for them. You teach someone to do it for themselves, because this is how we're learning how to hold and contain our own inner experience. So you'd close your eyes and you'd say, "Katherine, sweetheart, what are you feeling right now?" And you just wait until you can actually find the language that names the phenomenon in your body. "I'm feeling embarrassed." And then you just name it back to yourself. "Oh my gosh, I can see that you feel embarrassed." So you're almost locating yourself in two places. And by doing that, you have distanced yourself a little bit from the feeling. And the big problem that most of us have when we can't self-regulate is that we're overly identified with the feeling. So you're able to, send love to the part of you that's having that feeling. You can say, "What else are you feeling?" And you just keep going through until you've kind of named everything you've got going on in your belly. And then you can shift to the question, "Sweetheart, what do you need?" And this is a radical question for addicts, because, other than my addiction was food. I had a very bad food addiction. Well, other than I need a dozen donuts, like, what do I really need? I need rest, or I need to make amends to someone. I need to clean that mess up, or I need to find a way I need support. I need support to help me work this through. Right? So if we really start to learn how to know what's going on inside of us, and then we can also start to see some of the core assumptions that we are inside of about ourselves that were born from early relational trauma. And once you start to develop a relationship with yourself, you can also start to mentor yourself to more true meaning. And you can hold yourself when you're feeling like overwhelmed with the feeling of insecurity, like somehow suddenly you're not good enough and other people are better than you. And from your cognitive self, your adult self, the part of you in recovery, you can say, "Sweetheart, you're more than good enough for me. I love you just the way you are. You don't have to do anything to prove your value to me. And you are worthy of a place in this world." You can actually talk to yourself. Yeah.
That's so nice. I mean, just the two practical illustrations that I'm visualizing as I'm listening to you talking about the dangers of feelings not being labeled. I mean, ultimately, toxic or a harsh negative sentiment is something that we want to extricate from the room. And imagine trying to find something in the room, but you don't know what it is exactly that you're looking for. So the moment we give it a label, we're able to actually find it and deal with it and make it extrinsic and not allow this to be our identity. I mean, we all know that when the room is dark, it's a lot scarier and we don't know what's in there. The imagination of what could be there is always way worse than what is there. So the moment the lights are on and we actually see and there's a label to everything that's in the room, we're sort of placated. And then I really love how you did take it back again to the foundational point, which is when we have a healthy sense of self-esteem and we believe in ourselves unconditionally and we appreciate our non-negotiable infinite dignity, then the feeling will never paint and taint us and define us. So that's taking it back full circle. Until that stage of development and maturity, it wouldn't be wise to bring a partner on in a romantic sense to be, a suggestion. The suggestion, therefore, to not necessarily date for the first little while would be wise. Is what just to draw it back full circle. So the follow-up for just a moment, because there are people who will be listening and watching this that are obviously going to take what you're saying very seriously. And the follow-up question that has to be asked is, having a intimate confidant in one's life is a really important dimension to the overall human experience. And what happens during the time that they're abstaining from that? Are they just white-knuckling it? Is there some sort of alternative to get to receive that emotional satiation from what that brings you in life? Which way? I mean, white knuckling, it could be a path. You just wait until you get there, or is there another take on how to live life during that time period in your estimation?
Well, I think that early recovery is a time for relationship. And I think that this particular suggestion is about not starting a new sexual relationship. But I think recovery is all about being in relationship with others that you can tell the truth to, finally. One of the remedies for addiction is truth. And those of us who are susceptible to addiction are confused. We're generally confused about the truth. It was being denied in our home. It was our truth was being denied. We weren't allowed to tell the truth. So there's something beautiful about sitting in community and just speaking what's present for you without filtering it and telling the truth and having it received with no judgment, no assessment. That's right, that's wrong, that's good, that's bad. It's just having it received beautifully. So, in early recovery, you might have a therapist, although that is still a one-way relationship. And we're talking about learning how to have two-way relationships. So forming relationships, friendships with other people in recovery is going to be critical, but also going to different kinds of healers and learning how to experience different kinds of love. I mean, even repairing your relationship to God. Very often, addicts in recovery feel kind of morally bankrupt. Some of the things that we've done when we were out there, we've lost perspective. We've done things that are, kind of a violation of our own self in many ways. Maybe we undervalued ourselves or threw ourselves away sexually or, did all sorts of things. So we're really coming to a different relationship with ourselves, but also being open to the healing that others would like to bring to us, and the acceptance and the listening and the friendship. I do find that when we take a stand for ourselves, that the universe really meets us halfway, and that other people do too. People get touched when we take a stand for ourselves. And I think it takes a lot. Getting out of the cycle of addiction was probably one of the hardest things I have ever done. And I remember craving it just would take over my body. I used to describe it at the time as like a tidal wave. And before I got into recovery, I was estranged from my higher power. And there were things that had happened. I'd gotten really disappointed. And sometimes when you get disappointed in life, you stop praying, you start talking to God. I told you I had a spiritual awakening experience at the age of 14, and I was into that for years. But then I got really crushed by certain circumstances, and I got mad at God, and I didn't pray for 7 years. Then I go back into the 12-step program. I have to pray. So my big, you guys plug up your ears if you're afraid of bad language. But my first prayer was, F you, God. I don't even want to talk to you. I was mad. I was so mad I didn't talk to God for 7 years. So then I come into this program, I'm supposed to talk to God. I'm like, oh, well, that's not going to go well. But, thank God, we live in a benevolent universe, and I don't think God was really offended. I think, she was just happy I was starting the dialogue. And that's,
Right.
that was the beginning of the conversation.
That's beautiful. That's beautiful. There's an expression, I think it comes from Elie Wiesel, the famous Holocaust survivor, in which he basically said, you can love God, you can hate God, but don't be without God. That's
sweet. Ooh, just got chills on that.
Nice. Yeah. So I got another story for you as a prelude to the next question.
Okay.
The couple, they come to the marriage counselor, and the wife is wanting divorce, and the counselor says, "What is it?" And she says, "We're married for 33 years. That's a really long time. And not once has he ever told me I love you." The marriage counselor looks up at the husband and says, "Is that true? Really?" And he says, "Well, you should know better. It's not exactly the way she says it. We did get married 33 years ago, and the night of our wedding, I told her, I love you, and if anything changes, I'll let you know." Now, obviously, it's humorous and it doesn't work because relationships need to be maintained. There needs to be a constant sense of validation and affirmation. The question is, nobody wants to feel like they're a case, and nobody wants to feel like their relationship needs case management. We want to feel a sense of vibrance. We want to feel like the relationship is dynamic. So how do we balance conscious maintenance with organic flow? Are there times when you need to have contrived, planned interventions to keep the relationship alive? And does that undermine the authentic, organic nature of how things ought to flow?
I think it's important to distinguish and to just say outright that needing each other is a good thing. And I say that because I've met so many people who are trying to not need anything from anybody. We've kind of gone to the opposite end of the spectrum here, with our awareness that nobody can make me feel a particular way, that I shouldn't need anyone to complete me, that I should be happy all by myself. I shouldn't, think that relationship is somehow going to give me happiness. I have to find it within myself. So it's like, that's one sliver. That is all true. And it's not the end of the story. So all of us kind of, moving away from codependence, I think we went a little too far to thinking that we should just be autonomous and that was the goal. But it's not how nature designed us. So nature has really designed us to be interdependent creatures. And we do need to have relational environments where we feel accepted and seen and heard. And we need to know that if we speak, we have impact on those around us, that they hear us, that they adjust their behavior. We need to know that we have trust. We need to grow our capacities to love each other. These are really essential, holy, good things. We're back to, the top where, somehow we've divorced holiness from personal relationship. And Rabbi, you and I are gonna put an end to that in this conversation, I think.
I love that. There's actually a Talmudic passage that says that every relationship has a third party, has a third participant, and that is God, as it were. And it's not a mistake that when you bring holiness into the relationship, there is embedded and entrenched in the very fabric and foundation a certain transcendental quality that allows us to truly subscribe to something bigger than ourselves, so that we're not losing ourselves, but we're also not limited to ourselves. So when that happens...
I love that. We're not losing ourselves, but we're not limited to ourselves. That's gorgeous.
So, you mentioned...
Yeah.
Go ahead.
Well, I was just going to say, I was just having a conversation with someone yesterday, and they were talking about, relationship being a compromise. I said, I think I think it is, but I don't relate to the word. I don't relate to the word because I think relationship is a constant opportunity to go beyond yourself into a more expanded sense of self, so that you joyfully tend to the interests of both of you, not just the interest of one of you. So that doesn't occur as compromise to me. It actually occurs
Right.
as like privilege, right?
Oh, that's beautiful. There's an expression that if I can carry 50 pounds and you can carry 50 pounds, together we can carry 150. So there is a certain increased impact and elevated experience in this joining of forces. It's not just 1 + 1, which equals 2. There is a certain transformation that occurs. And that transformation stems and originates from us really rising even above our natural capabilities and capacity. And this kind of leads me to something I'd love to get a little bit of your insight and clarity on, which is, the two-way relationship versus the one-way relationship. There's a lot of discussion about codependency and one-way relationships. We obviously know the two-way relationships are the best, but what practical advice and takeaway can you give our listeners and viewers on how they ought to structure their own relationships in a way where there's a healthy sense of balance and there's give and there's take, and that it doesn't necessarily have to equal 50-50, but there's a certain chemistry that appreciates the fact that we are giving and taking? What practical tips would you offer? Because the devil's in the details, right? So and that's really one of the secret ingredients.
Yeah, lovely. I want to tie it into something that you had just said too, just before you even asked that question, because I feel that we were kind of touching on something really important. And that has to do with the recognition that certainly in America, and we might have listeners outside of America who could identify with this too, but in America, we really have we're in such a transition around our long-term relationships. And I think I researched this when I was writing the Conscious Uncoupling book, that there's a very large part of us that wants to just keep our word and stay through the tough times, for better or for worse. And we gave, we pledged our devotion to each other. We have an ideal of happy ever after. We're going to live happy ever after, which, by the way, that myth was created when the lifespan was less than 40 years of age, but we'll talk about that at another time. So you have this kind of, beautiful, stoic, solid, committed relationship in marriage. And in America, and I think throughout much of the more developing worlds, the developed worlds, is this pledge to self-actualization. And sometimes the two are at odds, where I'm going to be the most I can be. And I think probably, everyone here is growth oriented. So, there is a call to that, to grow myself, to be a better person, a healed person, a more loving person, a more successful person, a person of impact and substance in this world. That's where we're all called to become who we have the potential to be. So sometimes those things are at war with each other, and they don't make good bedfellows all the time. So there's something about what you said, JD, that actually really kind of brought it together, where we're talking about where you get to the place when you're self-actualizing, you're growing yourself, you actually can't go any further on your own. You actually need two of you there. You have to take the risk, to take the adventure into partnership with equal partners, so that you're expanding even more. I have found that when I am in partnership, that I can go much farther in giving my gifts to the world. So, but I have to be well enough in order to do that, so I don't repeat old painful patterns that I used to have, in the first 2 decades of my adulthood, where in every relationship I went into, I gave my power away. I silenced my voice. I disappeared myself. I almost trained people to be narcissistic because I was so afraid they were going to be angry with me. They were going to leave me. That was based on my childhood story. And so I had to recover from that. And I had to really work to gain a sense of self so that I could be a solid self to be in relationship. But, you also said, before do we ever get to graduate? Heck yeah. This work that you're doing on yourself, there is an endpoint. This is not just, forever just slogging through the mud of your psyche. There is, on the other side of this is joyful relationship, two-way relationship, being in relationship where your heart is open and the other person's heart is open and your home is fun and you're expressed in the world. Like that's what relationship can really do for us. I don't know if I answered your question about two-way and what practices are.
You did. And you actually triggered a beautiful thought that resonates with me all the time. You talked about shared power. So people tend to confuse power and influence. And they associate that if you have one, you have the other. If you're influential, you're powerful. And if you're powerful, you're influential. But when you dig a little deeper, the truth is that they're vastly, distinctly different concepts. And just suppose if I took away 9/10 of your power, you're only left with 10% of your power. But if I took 9/10 of your influence away from you, then your influence has actually been spread and multiplied by 90%. Your message has been enlarged and emboldened. And so, sort of like the thought was a little bit in the Bible, Old Bible, you have, the prophets and the kings. The kings were about power and the prophets were about influence. And today we continue to live our lives by their inspiration and their messages. So I feel like with power, it's a lot harder to share, but shared influence and shared values and shared ideals is something that is so much easier. The power, it requires a little bit more finesse because it's so, it's intermingled to a lot of concrete things that lend themselves to less effective sharing, but influence is so beautiful. We have run out of time, even though I haven't even been able to ask you a fraction of what I would love to. We'll have to have you again on the program again if your schedule allows it. This is so beautiful and heartwarming. Yeah. And I would like to thank you for your time and for your wisdom, Katherine. It's been tremendous, and the people listening and watching will walk away with such an enriched perspective on so many of these critical and crucial components into our relationships and subsequent overall happiness and serenity. And thank you to the audience for joining us again. You are not alone on this journey. So for inspiration, you can always find us at MontareBehavioralHealth.com, whether it's YouTube, Facebook, Instagram, and buy one of those beautiful books that Katherine Woodward Thomas has written, because they will help you and change your life for the better. Thanks, and we'll see you guys soon.